The book review, book discussion show. This week, the book is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. He wrote this book in 1931. He published it in 1932. And I had trouble with this book. I really had trouble. It's the first time in our series where I read a book and I had nothing. I had no reactions. I had no opinions. I had no emotions. There wasn't a line in it or an idea in it that I thought, oh, I really want to talk about this. I was just completely empty. I think perhaps one problem is that maybe I was too familiar with the book. I think I read it before. Maybe the ideas are so omnipresent with us that perhaps that's dulled my appreciation. Also, there's a whole realm of literature where I have nothing on just initial reading or just on its own. So, for example, I respect and admire the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, but if I was just to pick up the big book of AA and read it, it would do nothing for me. And the Bible, I respect and admire and appreciate the Bible, but if I just pick up and read the Bible, it doesn't do anything for me unless I have my frame of mind right. And I was just watching some videos on health, and I was just drifting off to sleep. And I don't think it was because of the inherent nature of the videos, and I don't think it was just because I had a big lunch. I think there are certain topics that they just start to deaden me. And also with Shakespeare is a literature that if I just read Shakespeare, I've got nothing. I could not do a show on Shakespeare unless I started consulting a bunch of commentaries. So what I had to do to finally come up with something to say on this show is that I just put into YouTube Brave New World analysis, and I put into Google Brave New World analysis, and I got the opinions of a lot of other people, and then that stimulated me, and then I was able to come up with some thoughts. But Richard, was this your first time through this book? How was your experience?
It was my first time through the book. I don't know why I hadn't read it sooner. I went to school in Ojai, and the director of the school there, was a private school, and the director of the school there was friends with Aldous Huxley. So I sort of have almost like a 6 degrees of separation with him. So I sort of felt a kinship, and I was reading that because I was, he and this guy Franklin Lacey was his name. He was the director of the Happy Valley School in Ojai, where I went during my high school years. And, he talked a little bit like Aldous Huxley. So I was, it was kind of bringing back some pleasant memories as far as that goes. But the book itself is deeply disturbing. I just found it like, he writes it in this kind of satiric tone. I think you're right to pick that up. I think the word you chose, mocking and satiric, and kind of there's almost a malevolence about the happiness. It's like happy with an evil glint in the eye, and he writes from that standpoint. And I imagine that's very much a literary choice, as he wants to make the characters in the book seem like the world is wonderful and it's great. But I was sort of left with, does he really believe that that's a terrible world, or is that the world he would like to see? And I based on reading the book and some of his subsequent comments, I'm not sure I'm not sure I can see a definitive position. I think he lived in the paradox of that.
All right. So as I researched the book, it became clear that Huxley was essentially satirizing the type of world that he longed for, in a sense. So he was not a big proponent of organized religion. He did not believe in democracy. He did not think democracy was up to the challenges facing it. So he liked the idea of some kind of total solution. He did not trust the masses. He has tremendous contempt for popular culture, for the masses. He has contempt for the daily newspaper, like other intellectuals. He has contempt for popular magazines, for the talkies and the feelies, for radio and for movies and for television. And he has particular contempt for congregational singing or group singing. And so he very much wants a world run by experts. He certainly flirted with eugenics. He had a stage in his life where he thought maybe the state should be in charge of reproduction. So I think what gives the book its enduring power is that many of the technological and social advancements in this brave new world he has flirted with. He has thought maybe this would be a good idea, but at the same time he is astute enough to see the downside for many of the things that he likes, because he is not coming to this book from a traditional religious perspective. He is someone who's flirted for quite some time with many of the technological, social, real by experts developments that are portrayed in Brave New World. But it's not clear that this book is either a utopia or a dystopia. You can make arguments either way, because there's virtually no crime in this book and in this world. There's very little suffering. There's apparently no hunger. There's abundant sexual satisfaction, and there don't seem to be horrible, people with awful defects walking around. They don't seem to be homeless. They don't seem to be ranting, crazy people making streets dangerous. So it seems to be an even mixture between utopia and dystopia. And I think he's wise enough to see the downsides of some of the things that he'd like to play with. Any reactions, Richard?
Well, I want to read a quote from Aldous Huxley. There was CBS did an hour-long program, which was kind of a condensation, kind of like a Reader's Digest version of Brave New World, which he narrated. And this was the opening narration. Brave New World is a fantastic parallel about the dehumanization of human beings in the negative utopia described in my story. Man has been subordinated to his own inventions, science, technology, social organization. These things have ceased to serve man. They've become his masters. A quarter of a century has passed since the book was published. In that time, our world has taken so many steps in the wrong direction that if I were writing today, I would date my story not 600 years in the future, but at the most 200. And then he actually has the quote, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." And I believe he's credited with that quote. That's very interesting, because on the one hand, he sees an ideal society. On the other hand, he sees it as destructive, and that's why I really couldn't get a read on it. It's almost like he's portraying both sides, and not necessarily taking sides. Although I think he has a very strong comment at the end of the book, but I'll hold off on that until we get a little deeper into this.
Okay, so that quote, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance," it actually goes back to 1809, a book called "The Life of Major General James Jackson." So the quote's been around for a long time, for over 200 years. It's also, I think, the quote of the Anti-Defamation League. It's kind of a tiring quote. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
I think the founders of the United States also, Benjamin Franklin said something very much like that. So it's not a new idea, but he certainly popularized it in the 20th century.
Okay, so you made some notes. You said how dehumanized are we today? So I don't think that we're any more dehumanized than 100 years ago, 500 years ago, or 5,000 years ago. I mean, human beings do long for utopia. We do long for a world that's free of suffering, and maybe even reduce the struggle would be nice. So everyone, I don't recognize today in Brave New World. Brave New World seems to me a parable and an intellectual exercise. I don't feel like we are living in Brave New World. But let me just throw your question back to you. How dehumanized are we today, and what does dehumanized even mean?
I guess we have to really wrestle with what we mean by dehumanized. And in order to do that, you have to go, well, what does it mean to be human? And I think that is really one of the key and core ideas of this book. Do human beings just want to, have pleasure, have all their needs met, be safe from danger. Is that all they want, or is there more? Is there that drive for individualism, for creativity? How much of a part of human beings is that really? And is taking that away, is removing that dehumanizing? I'll share another Huxley quote. This is from Brave New World Revisited. And I think this gives some insight into what he thinks. The real hopeless victims of mental illness are to be found among those who appear to be the most normal. Many of them are normal because they are so well adjusted to our mode of existence, because their human voice has been silenced so early in their lives that they do not even struggle or suffer or develop symptoms as the neurotic does. They are normal not in what may be called the absolute sense of the word. They are normal only in relation to a profoundly abnormal society. Their perfect adjustment to that abnormal society is a measure of their mental sickness. These millions of abnormally normal people living without fuss in a society to which, if they were fully human beings, they ought not to be adjusted.
Wait, who's that quote from?
That's from Aldous Huxley.
Okay, so you posed a question a few minutes ago. What does it mean to be human? And if I understood you correctly, you argued that what it means to be human is to struggle and to suffer. Essentially, the punishment or the consequence that God gave to Adam and Eve when they left the Garden of Eden. Is that what you're saying?
Well, let's put it this way. Creativity, the thing that seems to make us most human, solving difficult problems together collaboratively, is what actually makes us the most human. And that is usually done in the face of hardships.
Okay, so solving problems.
What that usually does is when let's take the United States, World War II. This country pulled together in a way they probably never have before or since to overcome something that was deeply threatening to our way of life and to the world as a whole. And that, was a juggernaut of all kinds of innovation and power and all sorts of other things, which we look at as like, that's what it means to be fully exhilarated, fully human, fully alive. The people portrayed in Brave New World, they're just living in comfort and drugged out. They're not really experiencing life to its fullest. They're experiencing life in such a narrow range of what is possible. And I think that's the dehumanization that Huxley is getting at. I think that is dehumanizing. And I think that goes to why you have, for example, they do fairly regular studies on employee satisfaction and on employee engagement. And what they find is 2 out of 3 people hate their job. They basically go to work and check out. That's 2/3 of the world. And that's in the United States. In Europe, it's even worse. It's 87% of the people are disengaged at work, which is a nice way, a pleasant way of saying they hate their job and they'd rather not be doing it. So is that dehumanizing? I would argue it probably is.
I'm thinking about there was this Christian street preacher, street pastor who during the LA riots, he heard that there was massive looting going on at this shopping complex. And so he went outside where all the looting was going down and he held up a placard that said, "Thou shalt not steal." And he got beaten up, put into a coma, and he died. So he was very human. He was taking a stand. He was taking a stand. He was trying to make the world a better place. He was confronting a problem, and he was mercilessly beaten down and murdered. My mother, She caught cancer when she was about 35 for the second time, and this time it killed her. So it took her down to about 60 pounds. She was 5'2", 60 pounds before she finally died at age 39. So the world we live in many respects, is a horror show compared to Brave New World. So, I mean, to live is
Yep.
to suffer. I mean, is this? I don't know. I'm just.
Yeah, that's the hard question of this book. Look, and I think that's he doesn't give you a real answer to that. And the truth is, I think the answers are or the comments on that are as unique as the individuals making them, because it's what we confront as being human. It's like, on the one hand, we want to make a utopia. We want to make a society that's free from suffering, free from all these things, like Brave New World. And yet, attempts to do that, Marxist attempts to do that, Greek city states, you know, Jonestown, the love children in the 60s, the hippies in the 60s trying to make a utopia. They all failed. They all failed because they don't take into account two things. One, the nature of the world we live in is one that is hostile and cruel and harsh to human beings. It's a scary place. It's a dangerous place. And human beings at the core have the capacity for malevolence that, unchecked, will run rampant.
Yeah. So one thing we can agree on is that the human being is fundamentally a dangerous animal. Is that fair?
Oh, I would say, yeah. Some people would say they're the most dangerous animal on the planet, and you can certainly make the case. On the other hand, they're capable of just the opposite. They're capable of being compassionate, loving, and caring in a way that no other animals are either.
And I think we would agree that reducing human suffering is, generally speaking, a good thing. For example, I'm just thinking of gunshot technology that police departments use in certain dangerous parts of town. They're able to triangulate whenever a gunshot goes off, and so they can arrive at the scene much more quickly. We also have advanced in ER medicine, so a lot of people who would used to die after getting shot or stabbed, they're now surviving. So we've had until recently steadily increasing life expectancy. All other things being equal, I think we'd agree that these are good developments.
I would say they are. In response to that, here's the thing. I notice in your notes you mentioned Rousseau and D.H. Lawrence and the people who romanticize the savage, which is the opposite of what Huxley does in this. He basically looks at the savage reservation as something really horrible and very undesirable, and uh, everything that's wrong with humanity exists in that context, and that the solution of the Brave New World is to overcome those things. But but you have to remember, this is a fiction, and this is all speculation. We have to somehow or other come to the real world, and in the real world, when we don't exercise, if you don't exercise your body, what happens to your muscles?
They get flabby.
That's right. And I think the capacity for healthy relationships, which is ultimately a moral issue. Morality, we think morality means being a good person. I think the heart of morality is the Jewish idea of righteousness, which is being right and doing right by other people. That's very different than, oh, I'm just a good person. That's like, whatever it takes for me to have the right relationships with the people around me, that's what I'm going to do. That's what religion does. And that is a muscle that has to be exercised. And if you don't exercise that muscle, the minute something goes wrong, everything falls apart. If you had a society of people who had no capacity to deal with difficulties, and something happened, you had a solar flare fry the grid and nothing worked anymore, what would those people do? They would be completely unprepared for dealing with each other and for dealing with those kind of hardships, which, sooner or later, something like that's going to come along. Because again, I come back to, the world is harsh and it's cruel. And while there are wonderful things and great beauty, there's also that same grave, inescapable hostility and danger that, in a sense, is always lurking around the corner, just around the corner. I
So
try to put it in different lines.
tough times make for tough people. Soft times make for soft people. But we would generally want to make life tougher and harsher than is necessary just to breed tougher people, or would we?
No, absolutely not. But here's an argument I'm making. I'm making in the book I'm writing, that we are in a morally challenging time of incredible scale. We're being confronted with all sorts of difficult problems. We have climate change, and I don't know where you stand with that, but I mean, it's clear that there's something going on there that's going to require that we collaborate as a species to come to a better understanding and a better balance with the world around us. We're going to have to do that, and we're going to have to work with each other in order to do that. And if we don't, there are consequences to that. We have the problems of living in big cities. You put more people together, you get more of the malevolence that human beings are capable of, but that has to be managed. And so, like you were saying, you have a system, you have policemen getting better at responding to that malevolence, to that crime, to that dark side of humanity. But we have to do that as a society, because if I'm going to go biblical for a second. I think that in Genesis, when it describes God creating man, he making man in his image, what he did is said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. And when you really take that and take it apart for what the people at that time would have understood about those things, and for what the image of God means in those two contexts, God creates order out of nothing, out of chaos. And so he made human beings in the image of one who does that. And he also made us, we're designed to collaborate. We're designed to create civilization. We create narratives that are the basis for civilization and for collaborative enterprises of every scale. And that's what we are. Ants build ant hills, bees build hives, we build cities and civilizations. That's what we do. And I think that's inherent in our design. So the problem of civilization, and let's Brave New World is a metaphor for what one possible solution for the problems we have in civilization. You mentioned, and I think it's hard to escape that some of the solutions in there make a lot of sense. Some of them seem very attractive, and I think they probably in the real world need to be considered in a very thoughtful way, recognizing that they're not simple solutions, that they're complex constellations of ideas and activities that we may not have complete control over. In fact, probably won't, but we can come to some understanding and in some kind of balance, come into some kind of balance with them.
So one of the benefits in Brave New World is that there's virtually no crime. And so I would be willing to give up quite a bit of liberty so that I could live in a world with virtually no crime. So I'm willing to sacrifice quite a bit to be able to walk around at night without fear, to have no fear of my car being broken into, or my home being broken into, or being hit over the head or stabbed or shot when I walk down the street at night. So anything we can do almost to reduce crime. So for example, if there was a shot that everybody could take that would reduce criminal tendencies, and there weren't huge side effects, like, I'd be down with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't care if that scares some people. It's like, oh, the jab. I don't want the government jabbing me. But if there's a shot that would stop infants being born with horrible diseases, if there was a shot that people could get that would prevent children from getting cancer, or with children being born disabled, I'd be for it. Like I believe in vaccines. I got the COVID vaccine as quickly as possible. I believe in getting vaccinated for everything that government health authorities recommends: measles, polio, smallpox, etc. I believe in fluoridating water. I believe in public health advances that we've made over the past 120 years. We've doubled lifespans, and I don't have a problem off the top of my head with anything that we've done to double lifespans over the past 120 years. So
on that point, I wholeheartedly agree. I was talking with some friends of mine. I said, 200 years ago, they used to have these things called chamber pots.
yeah,
You're not going to be
yeah,
on chamber pots, right?
yes,
And how did they dispose of the contents of that chamber pot, which is what you filled during the middle of the night when you had to get up and use, relieve yourself? What did they do with it? They threw it in the street.
oh,
They just threw it out the window. And 200 years ago, that was normal practice. Well, we don't do that anymore, thank God, because we learned some things. And the fact that we as a species can share information the way we do, and learn from and have the capacity to actually learn from our mistakes and course correct, I think we've done a lot of good things. The argument I make is that human beings are here to create civilization. That's what we do. However you think we arrived at that, whether that's a completely evolutionary process by random natural processes, or whether you subscribe to an intelligent design for that. Either way, that's what you have, and that's what we do, and that's something that as both as individuals and corporately, as neighborhoods, cities, countries, etc., have to come to terms with. And I think, in a way, I think this book gets at some of those issues in a very interesting, although somewhat disturbing at times, in a very, but it gets at the issues. And I think, for me at least, it kind of opened up a lot of thinking about that. And,
yeah. Now that you say that, I realize I did have emotions reading, or possibly I was rereading this book. I did feel repelled, disgusted, disturbed. I think disturbed was the strongest emotion that I had, particularly the lack of family, the lack of marriage, the lack of monogamy, the lack of parents and children, father and a mother, the romantic love being accompanied by sexual monogamy, lack of religion, the lack of history, the lack of art. I found all these things incredibly disturbing. What were the things that you found most disturbing?
and yet, and here's why it's so disturbing, in my opinion. Why it's so disturbing is because, in spite of all that, the appeal of not having to suffer, of not having to deal with, the indignities of life, for example, not having to date, but just being able to have any woman you want, anytime you want. When I thought about that, and there's this one scene early in the book where the director of Hatcheries and Predestination taps Lenina, the one of the main characters of the book, pats her ass basically, and says, "Hey, let's get together tonight and make some time here." And I looked at that, and that was normal in that society. That was considered a social norm, and in fact, it was one that was enforced. And everybody belongs to everybody else, so you can sleep with whoever you darn well please, and that's wonderful. That's what makes a healthy society, because you no longer have to have this. Well, I'm loyal to this one person, and if I do something, and if I don't do that, then I'm this terrible person who should have shame heaped on them, and in the worst case scenario, taken out and stoned by the community. You know, um, you know, but here's the thing about that. You know, and on the surface, it sounds good. Of course, you look at it today and you have the Me Too movement, and I wonder how, you know, any of those women would look at that. They would, I don't think they would feel very good about that, to tell you the truth. I think they would, you know, be up in arms about that, going, you know, how dare they, you know, because that seems like a very something that men would be more interested in than women, I think.
Yes.
I'd love to see some studies done about that. Just, you know, what do you think about that? What if we live in that kind of world and see where the preferences fall? My suspicion is they'd fall on the male side very strongly, and on the female side not so much, if at all.
Now, a lot of people I know feel like they're living in a dystopia right now. I even had a friend talk to me yesterday about how with vaccine passports, it will be like living in Nazi Germany. And I don't share any of those sentiments, but do you feel
Not
like
either one.
do you feel like American 2021 is a dystopia?
No, actually, I don't. And I think the people who think so have a very distorted view of what life has been in the last, you know, 6,000 years of human history. You know, because we live in the most privileged, comfortable, interesting, creative, and rife with potential society that's ever existed in the history of mankind. And if that's dystopia, I think that dystopia is happening on the inside of the person, not so much on the outside. But
Yeah,
you know, that's where those things live, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. And say with regard to COVID, I'm sure government officials, politicians, and bureaucrats and medical and public health authorities made some mistakes in their responses to COVID. But I see people in authority doing the best they can. I see them
Mhm.
as flawed and fallible as I am. I see them making mistakes. I see them responding to incentives, sometimes perversely to incentives. But there's nothing in our quote unquote overlords that I don't recognize in my own soul. How about you? What was your COVID experience? Did you feel like our overlords were just being as punitive as possible, or did you recognize in their efforts that they were fallible human beings, very much like yourself, try to do the best they could with a difficult situation?
The latter by far. And I think, you know, I say this sparingly because it's a dangerous thing to say. But I think when somebody opens their mouth, there's only one person they're talking about, and that's themselves.
Hmm.
So when somebody projects that onto leadership, I think they're telling you something about who they are and how they operate and what they dread and what they try to control and how they would control if they were given that opportunity. I think it tells you a lot about what's really going on inside of that person. Now, I'm obviously there are exceptions to that. You can't just make that a general rule, which is why I say I use that very sparingly. But I think, you know, the way that human beings construct our understanding of the world is ultimately a subjective process. The challenge is to have that subjectivity aligned appropriately with with the objective or the, you know, the greater world around us. That's to me that's an art form, and in fact that's kind of what recovery is all about, is learning how to do that.
I have to limit my consumption of material like Brave New World because it's disturbing. Now I can look it in the face. I can read the book. It doesn't cause me to act out and violate my sobriety, but it's something that I'm going to limit. I'm not going to consume a whole bunch of material like Brave New World. I'm not going to consume a whole bunch of disturbing material. When I walk down the street and I see dog poo on the sidewalk, I'm going to avoid it, and I'm not going to spend time looking at it or smelling it. What's your ability to consume disturbing material like Brave New World?
um, it's the first time I've read a book like that. So I don't think I've come to terms with that, although, you know, there's so many things I want to read. I have to be selective, so it has to make sense to what I might be working on or to what is really actually important to me. In the case of Brave New World, the conversation about how we manage our greater society and what the problems and pitfalls are is actually interesting to me. Um, the negative side of it, you know, I think at least for myself, you know, I can read things that I disagree with, and I'm secure enough in my own beliefs and in my own, you know, at home in my own skin enough that, you know, that's not going to throw me in a bad direction or have an undue influence on me. That being said, I wouldn't make that, you know, I wouldn't have a predominance of books like that in my reading list
Yeah.
by any means, and I just don't see any value in that. So at that part, I agree with you. I think it's just a matter of, you know, whether you could do two and I could do four. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Something is kind of along those lines. It's like, yeah, I might have a little more of an appetite for that, so long as they, you know, really pose questions that are actually useful, or questions that are relevant, or questions that stimulate discussion that ultimately is useful, which I think this book does. At least it does. At least it did for me.
To what extent are we living in Brave New World?
Well, I would say a pretty good amount. You know, the way he described, I mean, we certainly don't have decanting of embryos and that kind of genetic engineering and control. We certainly don't have that. Um, Although I'm sure there are people who would like to do that. um, we certainly don't have that. Um, However, you know, the preoccupation with pleasure and play and, you know, what he calls the feelies, which is another way of saying movies, although they were somewhat more sophisticated because they included olfactory uh, characteristics as well as visual things. It incorporated a lot of things, which, by the way, at that time was certainly being explored. There were artists who were going, well, movies should have sight and sound and smell, and you know, the chair should shake. And of course, they're exploring that now in virtual reality, and we're going to come into that. We're going to see more and more of that. Whereas, you know, you detach yourself. The whole purpose of those is to detach yourself from the deeper drives and survival instincts, you know, the basic instincts that allow us to operate in a hostile world, by removing it. And then we medicate that, and then they were medicating it even further. I think we're doing a pretty good percentage of that now. And I think, you know, and I think legalizing marijuana is definitely a step towards soma.
Mm.
But,
Yeah.
you know, that you draw the line at, well, you know, toward the end of the book, when the savage goes out and he's trying to tell these people in the fertilization laboratory, you've got to be free, you've got to be free, and then they come along with soma spray, you know, and they literally spray the crowd with soma so everybody goes under. Well, we aren't quite there yet. But, you know, people more and more are choosing to be medicated, detached, and numbed from the realities of life.
So, do you think that the massive use of psychiatric medication, from, I don't know, lithium to whatever's hip now, Valium, I don't see it on total as clearly negative. Um, you can make, I think certainly there are some people who are on too much or probably shouldn't be on it at all. I think there are plenty of people for whom it's had a negative effect. But let's, for example, take the opioid crisis. The overwhelming number of people who die from opioids are taking illegal opioids. They're not taking that which is prescribed by their doctor. They're taking illegal fentanyl and illegal drugs that they're buying on the streets. It's not coming from prescriptions. So we definitely have an opioid crisis, but it's primarily a crisis from the illegal manufacture. My life was completely transformed. I went from bedridden to approximately normal by taking a psychiatric medication called Nardil. in late 1993. So I was on lithium for about 5 years, and it had a beneficial calming effect on me when I needed it. So I see a lot of people out there whose lives are improved by psychiatric medication. I suspect that there's a large number of people for whom the net effect of psychiatric medication is negative. But to me, it's not at all clear that the net effect of psychiatric medication in the United States today is clearly negative. Any thoughts?
Well, there's, um, I've never had the opportunity to take those, so I don't have that personal experience. So I'd be reticent to comment on that basis. And I think that there's two parts that I think the value of medication is to calm down symptoms so that you can deal with the underlying causes. And if you deal with the underlying causes, I think they can be remarkably beneficial. When you're in pain, you know, there's nothing wrong with, pain medication. It's there to mitigate the pain and it's useful in that capacity. But like so many things in the world, the way that it is, things exist within a very narrow range that's healthy, and outside of that, on either level, becomes destructive. So
Yeah,
that's
but is it clear to you that overall psychiatric medication is playing a overall negative role in American life?
I think people depend on it more than they ought to. And for that, one of the things I would quote is Johann Hari's book Lost Connection. He was he was depressed and he suffered from clinical depression, and he took medication for years, and it did nothing but harm. And when he started pursuing relationships and he started getting healthy in that way, all of those issues disappeared. Now, he makes a case based on his own experience. Now, I don't have experience with those kind of medications. I do have experience, with drugs and medicating, the pain of life by a substance. So I do know something about that. And I do know that ultimately the road out of that you know, is being properly aligned, is having a healthy psychology, is having healthy attitudes. That's ultimately the way out of that. So I think that what is happening probably more often than not is that, you know, um, practitioners, healthcare practitioners, psychologists, psychiatrists, they'll prescribe drugs because it's an easy way out, and they won't really deal with the underlying issues. And I think that trend, I believe, is increasing. I don't have any statistics to back it up, so let's just call that, Richard's gut instinct.
And
But I read enough of the news, and I read enough of, I talk to enough people to have formed that opinion. And when I was working for Sprint, I also formed the opinion about 2 out of 3 people hated their jobs, and statistically that was borne out. So those instincts may have some veracity, but I wouldn't depend on them.
so I notice almost all rabbis, of which I'm aware, are telling people get vaccinated. What about Christian clergy that you know?
I would say the ones I know are in favor of it. The most notable who isn't would be a guy like John MacArthur, and he's very much been in the news. And it's interesting that we didn't have massive deaths and breakout at his church. In fact, our church, where we got where people wore masks and did all that, we actually had more per capita loss from COVID than he did. That's a fact I can report. So but for myself, I've decided to get vaccinated. I've been vaccinated many times in my life. I've never found it to be a problem. I haven't so far found it to be a problem. And I think the overabundance of agenda-driven information and disinformation and misinformation being circulated makes it very difficult to know what is actually true.
Now, I was reading, I wanted to understand the different ways that the American right responded to COVID. And one academic paper I read said that conservatives have much greater belief in the power of free will and the power of your choices to shape your outcomes, while people who are left of center believe much more in the power of randomness to affect you. So I assume you're a big believer in free will, and I assume that you're you're a big believer that we have tremendous power to shape the outcomes of our life.
Well, I think we have agency in that. Yeah, I don't think we have final power. You know, everything that I learn in program is I'm powerless over many things in life, but I'm not powerless over my response to that. And so, yeah, that has a lot to do with it.
Now let's go back to 2 out of 3 people hating their jobs. Is that
Gallup does a poll twice a year called the Employee Engagement Survey, and they've done that for almost 25 years. And consistently, the statistics are you have 30% of the people who engage in their jobs, who like their job, who go show up to work and are excited to be there, are happy to be there, and love their job, love the business, you know, all that stuff. Then you have 70%. I mean, and the percentages will vary year over year. They do it twice a year, and it'll vary somewhat, but it really kind of settles down into about 70-30. That 70% hate their jobs, and what they call them is they're disengaged. And it means, you know, they basically go to work, hold their nose, collect a paycheck, and go home. That's a sweeping generalization of what's happening, but I observed that. I was inside of many businesses when I was an account manager for Sprint of all sizes, and I could see that just anecdotally. I could see that happening. It was very apparent.
okay?
Very
So
clear. The other part of that is there's somewhere between 50 and 20% who are what are termed actively disengaged. That means not only do they not like their job, they're going to go out of their way to sabotage the company, their fellow employees, or the efforts of that company or their customers in one way or another. And that is estimated to cost the US economy somewhere in the range of about $550 billion a year.
and so I think that's accurate, and I don't really know what it means. I would expect that for most people, work is going to be onerous. So hate may be a little stronger than I would prefer to see people experience, but it does not surprise me that most people would find their work onerous and unpleasant, and be glad to be done with it. And I think that's pretty much inherent in the human condition. But what do you take away from that? Is this a crisis? Is this a spiritual crisis? Is social crisis an economic crisis? What is it?
That's a really good question. Um, I'm gonna come back. I'm gonna come to that through Brave New World, through what they did and this their solution to that problem, because they did propose one, and their solution was to precondition individuals within certain classes so that they would want to do the job they were doing. And actually, here's a quote from the director of Hatcheries and Predestination, directly from the book. Now, here's where we actually predestine and condition. Nothing is so unstabilizing to society as unhappy people. We avoid all that by preconditioning embryos. That is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their inescapable social destiny. That's their solution to that. But that's a very real problem. Now that's almost that's a caricature. I mean, because the likelihood that that will ever actually happen, I think, um, where human beings are still something that we recognize as human beings is probably not likely. It's possible, of course, and that's what Huxley was getting at. He was warning us that it could get there, and he's right. It could get there if we go that far. But the role of religion is to train the human being to respond to life in a positive way. I think the trend we see in our society of people not liking their jobs and people not liking life in general is related to the fact that they don't do that work, that they don't really pursue cultivating the capacity for resilience, the capacity to live life as it is, not as they'd rather have it be, but literally in program terms, take life on life's terms and find it satisfying and find it and be grateful for what they have, not like as some mindless exercise, like I'm grateful for my broken leg, which is, the height of stupidity, in my opinion. But, I'm grateful that, when I have a broken leg, that I have a doctor I can go to and people who will help me. And, I can learn more about myself and I can learn more. And I'm grateful for the lessons that I've learned as a result of that. I'm not grateful for the broken leg, but I'm grateful for the things that I learned from that. And I think those kinds of things come as someone really engages in a spiritual life. What's so disturbing about Brave New World is there's not a single thing spiritual about it. Everything is mechanized, everything is automated, everything is programmed. People really have no free will.
So, Brave New World has a strong caste system, and this does not appall me. I prefer the American openness, but I also see tremendous advantages to a caste system in that people know who they are. And so, one problem with a wide open society like America is that a lot of people don't know who they are. So, at least in a caste system, people know who they are. And as long as the contributions of each group are honored, I mean, there are workplaces where, let's say, the boss is earning $200,000 and he works damn hard and he spends, let's say he spends $100,000 a month to market his product to keep the pipeline flowing. So he's putting things on the line to an extent that his employees are not. And then let's say the boss then has 3 managers earning around $100,000 and they implement his vision. And then there are a whole string of other employees who are earning between $30,000 and $70,000 who have comparatively easier jobs than those who are earning 6 figures. They don't have to worry about anything, and it can suit them fine. So I am familiar with a lot of workplaces where they're stratified, where the boss may be bringing in, say, multiples of hundreds of thousands of dollars. There may be other employees earning 6 figures, and then there are a bunch of employees, earning $40,000, $50,000 a year, but they have much easier jobs. So social stratification, a class system, and a caste system does not appall me. It's not my ideal. I like the American way, but it doesn't evoke a feeling of horror for me. How about for you?
Well, it's not a simple question. I think it's a very complex issue, and I think you're right in that there are some clear advantages for knowing, what your role in society is. However, the what you described in the workplace is, we don't have anything like, in India they have a caste system. If you're a Brahmin, you're going to be like in Brave New World, it's like you're an alpha plus. It's like all the doors are open to you. You have a greater level of responsibility, more is expected of you, but you're also privileged to compensate for that. And you're always going to be that. You're never not going to be that. Whereas if you're an epsilon or a gamma, like you work in a mine or something like that, you'll never ever have any opportunity to change that or to do something different. Now, that's very different than what we have in the United States. That's very different than having different roles at a company, because you could be the assistant to to the manager of a company in one setting, but you could go to another company and you could be the manager. You could leave that company and start your own business in which you're the boss. That's the advantage of our system. So that we don't have anything like that kind of a caste system. And if we did, capitalism wouldn't work. And if capitalism didn't work, the world would be worse off for it.
So, how much of your life have you lived in California?
All of it.
Okay, so I've lived 80% of my life in California, and I love life in California. Compared, though, to other states, particularly on the East Coast, I noticed that Californians have much weaker ties in general to family, to tradition, to ethnic group, and to religion. I remember spending 3 weeks in New York City on the Upper West Side, and I felt the importance there of where you go to school. I felt the importance there of ethnic ties to an intensity that I did not know in California. I felt the intensity of commitment to religion in New York that I rarely saw in California. I felt kind of just the solidity of tradition, the way it limits you. I felt much less free in New York. I felt like there were far fewer options. So I love California, but I also recognize California as the place that people generally come to escape the pulls and obligations of tradition, family, ethnicity, and religion. And so one way I think of understanding Brave New World is it's very much a satire of California. And so there's Lenina has a funny line in here where she says, "Hug me till you drug me, honey. Kiss me till I'm in a coma. Hug me, honey, snuggly bunny, love's as good as Soma." So the honey there particularly, and snuggly bunny, this is very much California talk. So this book is a satire on California as essentially the least traditional state. So it's the state of all the 50 closest perhaps to Brave New World. Any thoughts?
Well, I've had the opportunity to travel around the country and doing business. So I've been not for long periods of time, but I've experienced the way people are in other states, in Minnesota and Texas, in New York. Certainly, I have family in New York, Massachusetts, Florida, many all over the country. And people in Tennessee, they're very happy by and large with those family ties and with all that human connection. They like it, and that's why they're there. And so I think there's some accuracy to that. And California, especially Los Angeles, its history is really rather unique. I to me, Los Angeles is the most creative city in the world. In the sense that there's so much here that can allow things to happen, and it's cultural. It's foundational to how this incredible metropolis, emerged and evolved over a very short period of time. There's a lot of history in LA, but it took place over 150 years, basically. You have the growth of a major metropolis in 100 years. Now, it's not unique in that there are other places where that's happened. You look at Las Vegas, and that's actually kind of happened there too. It went from being, a town of 300,000 people 50 years ago to being a town of 3 million. That's pretty significant growth. And so that is happening other places, but Los Angeles was really the first place in the country that happened. And there were many factors that made that possible, but not the least of which was the ideal weather, and just all a confluence of all kinds of different things. The value of the land that people perceived, they were they were coming here in droves and buying land, and things were happening. You had the film industry, you had the oil industry, you have all these things which make so much possible that would not have been possible otherwise. And Los Angeles is not like the reality of the rest of the world. It is a unique culture. It's like no other culture. And what's possible here isn't possible anywhere else. And so I think it's a fair analogy to say that Huxley, who lived here at the time he wrote, I believe he was living here at the time he wrote Brave New World, might have certainly been influenced by that, and our sense of other people and our place with those other people and the value of those other people is very different here than it is in New York. In New York, if you make a promise to show up somewhere, you damn well better show up. And if you don't, they won't talk to you. That's true in Texas and that's true in Minnesota. It's not true here in LA. You're expected to go, yeah, I'll show up unless something better comes along. That's considered normal here. It's not considered normal elsewhere. So that is a cultural issue that influences relationships in a very profound way. So in some ways, I think it's a fair analogy.
So I don't feel like overall the American right had a good COVID. I saw vast segments of the American right underestimating the severity of the virus. I still see vast segments of the American right denying the efficacy of vaccines. I see large segments of the American right saying, we're individuals. I hate these restrictions on individual freedom, and they're totally unnecessary, and it's just totalitarian Democrats wanting to go all communist on us. So I've seen a lot of moronic responses on the part of my end of the political spectrum to the COVID epidemic, and I think part of it comes from a stupid knee-jerk reaction by the right that government is the problem. And so certainly government is sometimes the problem. Some problems are better solved by other means, but there are other problems like COVID that come around that do demand a massive government intervention. So Huxley was writing Brave New World in the aftermath of World War I, which saw unprecedented levels of government intervention into daily life. And he was somewhat, I think, entranced by that, inspired by that, and affected by that. And so some people over the past 18 months have tried to make the argument, we're living in Brave New World, or we're living in 1984 because we have these unprecedented levels of government intervention in our daily lives, that all sorts of rights that people took for granted, such as freedom to assemble, freedom of worship, freedom to go to church, freedom to travel, freedom to go to work, freedom to hug and kiss each other, freedom to socialize, have been ripped away. And to me, that's situational, that there are going to be situations that call for massive government intervention, and that's not necessarily a dystopia, that there will be other situations that will be better solved by, say, government getting out of the way. But this knee-jerk response that anything government does is a problem, or the government is always the problem, or that we always need less government, and if we don't maintain eternal vigilance on restricting government, we're going to end up in some kind of Brave New World dystopia. I reject that. Anything there that you want to comment on?
I agree with you actually wholeheartedly. I just think we have to strike a balance between the value of the individual and the value of our community and how we fit into the community. One of the reasons I responded the way that I did to the COVID crisis, which I didn't have a negative experience. I had, it for a variety of reasons, it was just the right thing at the right time for me to, move forward in the things that I wanted to move forward in. But beyond that, having to wear a mask, I went, well, okay, I don't particularly like it. And I'm not certain whether it's good, but I'm going to err on the side of being considerate of other people and not putting other people in danger. I think that's a very healthy approach. If we live in a society with thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people, And we all have an effect on each other, and we have to take that into account. You can't simply say the individual is greater than that in all circumstances. You go to Star Trek. Sometimes the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the one, which Spock would say, but sometimes the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many, as Kirk would say. And I think there's a balance between those two things that we haven't struck in this country.
And
We live.
go ahead.
Let me just finish the thought. The thing is, we live in a very complex world. A very complex world requires a very high level of collaboration. That high level of collaboration requires a certain amount of surrendering of your individual preferences and desires for the benefit of the greater good. It's necessary. The Japanese do it better than we do. They do it pretty well compared to us. I mean, I'm not idolizing them, but yeah, that's what I want to say about that.
So Brave New World also satirizes Keynesian economics, and over the past 18 months, we've experienced an unprecedented level of Keynesian economic investment because the GDP, I think, went down something like 32% in the second quarter of 2020, and then it bounced back at about the equivalent level the next quarter, thanks to trillions and trillions of dollars of government intervention. So government told people to socially distance and made it difficult or impossible for millions, tens of millions of Americans to work. On the other hand, it did send out approximately $2,000 in stimulus checks, which I think were important. It also used a paycheck protection program that maintained millions and millions of jobs. So everything can be satirized, but I'm just thinking of how awful the past 18 months would have been without this Keynesian intervention in the economy. And I think it saved tens of millions of people from extreme suffering. And so I think government certainly made a lot of mistakes with response to COVID. But overall, I think we did pretty good. There's a lot that I'm grateful for with how our government responded to this unprecedented crisis. Any thoughts?
Again, I find myself, very much in agreement with you about that. I have to confess, I haven't really read John Maynard Keynes. I haven't done that yet. I haven't even really read Adam Smith, which is I'm trying to remedy that, but I'm familiar with his philosophy. And, here's the truth about capitalism and about economies. Money is loaned into existence. That's what makes capitalism work. And in fact, for millennia of human history, before we actually started doing that, you really never had progress. You never really had any kind of significant progress or growth in terms of culture, in terms of realistically lifting people out of poverty. The last 100 years has seen more people come out of poverty on an extraordinary level, like 10 times what it was in the past. And this has been measured. The United Nations has measured this, that they've seen that more people are out of poverty than any other time in human history by an extraordinary margin. That is all based on capitalism, because capitalism creates wealth, and in order to create wealth, you have to. And so in this case, in Keynesian philosophy, government takes the risk of capitalizing the economy so the economy doesn't collapse. And that works as long as the economy recovers and they're able to recoup that, and actually the economy grows ultimately as a result of that. And I'm not persuaded that that's wrong, especially in this case. I actually think it was the right call in this case, not in every case, but in this case, I think it was, because the government had to enforce some restrictions, and you can argue whether they were necessary or not, but the truth is we don't really know. This is new ground in many ways, and we're still finding our way through that. We had a major pandemic 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, We learned something from that. We learned something from this, and we've certainly learned more from the Spanish flu than they knew during the bubonic plague. So we've been making progress on this, and as inhabitants of civilization, we are getting better at doing this, and I think we have to continue to get better at doing this. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, that is a trial and error process. And sometimes, we make the right decision, and sometimes we make the wrong one. Hopefully, as a society, we can learn from the wrong decisions and double down on the good ones when they're good.
I want to read a phrase here from Aldous Huxley. God isn't compatible with machinery and scientific medicine. I just want to take that phrase. So certainly the realm for God has considerably narrowed over the past 1,000 years. So it used to be that there was no separation of church and state like we have now. There was just one church 1,000 years ago. So you didn't have these separate spheres. Also, we didn't have scientific medicine like we have now. So certainly the rise of science, the rise of secular education, the rise of medicine, the rise of knowledge has perhaps reduced the realm of what we ascribe to God. All right, so it used to be we ascribed everything to the gods or to God, and now we ascribe fewer things to God than people did in the West 1,000 years ago. But I'm not sure. God isn't compatible with machinery and scientific medicine. I don't think that's true. I think you can have a highly automized society. You can have a highly industrialized society. You can have cutting edge scientific medicine, and I don't think that's going to significantly reduce belief in God. But is God compatible or incompatible with industrialization, machinery, and scientific medicine?
Well, again, the argument I would make is that God made us to do those things. Mm-hmm. God, if you believe in intelligent design, then we were designed to build civilizations that would find ever improved ways to utilize the resources we found at hand. So I think God has a hand in that in a way that people like that was from the Mustafa Mann, the world director of the world, that section of the world. He was like like something really along the lines of a prime minister of a region, and that was his opinion. Now obviously Huxley is stating an opinion which I believe he probably held because he didn't like organized religion, and to be fair, neither did Bill W. But that doesn't mean that he didn't recognize that spirituality is very, very real, and it goes well beyond our capacity to understand it scientifically. You and I reviewed William James' book, The Variety of Religious Experience, and he couldn't explain that stuff. And we still can't explain how all that happens. It does, but we really don't understand it fully. Science is a tautology. It can explain how things work, but it doesn't really explain what they are or why they work. But it does observe clearly how they do work, and that's very useful. So I think that's the place of science. But I certainly subscribe to the idea that the world we live in and the surrounding cosmos was created intelligently for a purpose. I'm not going to comment on what those purposes might be, so I think that's beyond my pay grade. But given that assumption, I think it's fair to say that we operate within that.
So, after reading Brave New World, how then shall we live, to use a New Testament phrase? And I'll answer the question first. I think reading this book should renew our gratitude for family, for commitment, for monogamy, for spirituality, for God, for religion, for history, for art, for the struggle and the challenge of life, that we can feel new senses of gratitude for what we have today. But if I throw the question over to you after reading Brave New World, how then, Richard, shall we live?
Well, you again, I'm gonna have to strongly agree with you about that response to it. And I think, in many ways, Huxley had that in mind. I think he saw from certainly where he sat as an intellectual and in the conversations he had with the people around him. I mean, he's a member of the Algonquin Circle, so he talked to a lot of different writers and a lot of intellectuals and people who look at what's going on in the world around them and have ideas about it more so than the average person. So he thought about that a lot, and so his reflections are valuable, just if nothing else for creating a set of distinctions that are worth looking at, that are worth examining on a much broader scale than an average person might be inclined to do. So I think it's very valuable to look at those distinctions in our culture. What do we want to do with the capacity to control our genetics? What do we want to do with how we deal with the family? I saw in one of your notes, and I actually like it, and it's a very good question. If you have to have a license to drive a car, why don't you have a license to, be a parent? That's a good question, because there's a lot of hideous parenting going on, and it creates a world of malevolence, and it creates the very thing in humankind that we don't want. And so that's a question that I think can be posed to us as a society. How do we actually deal with it? How do we actually improve our record in that area? How do we, as a society, produce better human beings? I would subscribe to the fact that healthy parents and a healthy family structure is probably one of the best ways, one of the ideal ways to do that. The idea that you just have society as a whole with no real connections really cuts at the heart of what relationships are all about. And if we're made for anything, we're made for relationships. The whole of creation operates on things being related to one another. How hydrogen relates to oxygen gives us water, and that gives us something that's immensely useful and an intrinsic part of every living thing, certainly here on this planet. So, but that has to do with a relationship. And so everything does come down to our capacity for relationships. And so is our relationship, as in Brave New World, only to our society, and the experiences we have with individuals are only incidental to that, or are those relationships and what that produces in us? Because when you have good relationships, you release dopamine, you release oxytocin, you have well-being that's produced by relationships. And I don't think that what they are doing, what the engineering they did in Brave New World, would necessarily produce that in quite the same way, or would have it ultimately be quite as satisfying. But that is the question he poses.
So
in fact,
go ahead.
The director says it this way: I think civilization is horrible, and yet people are happy. They get what they want, and they never want what they can't get. They're well off, they're safe, they're never ill, they're not afraid of death, they're blissfully ignorant of passion and old age, they're plagued with no mother or father, they got no wives or children to feel strongly about. So they're conditioned that they practically can't help behaving as they ought to behave, yet you ask them to chuck all this away for liberty? And then he says, John, the character, the savage, says, all the same, it seems quite horrible to me. And then the director's response is, of course it does. Actual happiness always looks pretty squalid in comparison with the overcompensations for misery, and being contented has none of the glamour of a good fight against misfortune. Happiness is never great. See, but you talk to someone like Jordan Peterson, and he will go, the myth of the hero's journey. He would argue that that's intrinsic to our psychology on an evolutionary basis, and that is so deeply rooted in us that's why we'll watch a movie where you see this hero's journey. We're projecting who we are and what we are onto that, and I don't think you can just engineer that away, with the kind of things they're talking about in Brave New World. I think those things remain, and I think that's really the warning of the book is that, if you don't really recognize that the individual is just as important as society, you will lose the individuality, which is why the character John hung himself at the end, because he couldn't fit into the society that he had, which he hated. I think that's really one of the messages of the book.
One part of the book that rang particularly false for me was the power of propaganda. I think most people dramatically overestimate it, but according to the academic research I've read, propaganda rarely changes anyone's mind. It simply facilitates people who want to go in a direction. It gives them reasons for going in that direction. So this idea that the regime can come along and propagandize people in their sleep, that it can completely condition people contrary to their evolutionary biases, their intrinsic neurological and biological predispositions. That part rang false to me, but I know it's widely believed that there's this great fear that propaganda has the ability to essentially turn people into zombies, and I don't buy it. Any thoughts?
Well, that I said that in more or less in a different way, but more or less the same thing, is that there are certain things that are intrinsic to our neurology, to our biology, and to our makeup that will not yield to that kind of influence, that will assert themselves at some point in time, sooner or later. I shared with you the example of the first Jurassic Park movie, where they had all these wonderful things. We created these dinosaurs, we created this land, we have this fence, we have all these safeguards, we have all this, and Jeff Goldblum's character said, "You're out of your mind. This is not going to work. Life will find a way to overturn this." And that was the whole point of that movie. And I think that deep biological genetic makeup or endowment that we have isn't going to yield to the kind of propaganda that they put in this book. So I agree with you. Yes, it rings false, because what is in us is not even known to us to the degree that we think we know it. It's much deeper and much further beyond our control than I think we take into account.
My favorite character in the book is the main character, Bernard Marx. He's a sleep learning specialist. He's an alpha plus. He's the very creme de la creme upper class of society, but he's also a misfit. He is unusually short for an alpha, and supposedly his blood surrogate had a little too much alcohol in his system, and this has left him slightly stunted. He has an independence of mind stemming from his inferiority complex and his depressive nature, more than from any philosophical depth. Unlike his fellow utopians, Bernard is frequently angry, resentful, and jealous. He's sometimes cowardly and hypocritical. His conditioning is clearly incomplete. He doesn't enjoy communal sports, solidarity services, or even promiscuous sex. He doesn't even get much joy out of Soma. He is in love with Lenina, but he doesn't like her sleeping with other men, even though everyone belongs to everyone else. His triumphant return to utopian civilization with John the Savage precipitates the downfall of the director, but Bernard's triumph is short-lived. He is ultimately banished to an island for his non-conformist behavior. Any particular characters in this novel speak to you?
Well, I think Bernard Marx is the hero of the story. He and John are the two representatives of what we really are as human beings, juxtaposed against the kind of civilization and culture we are attempting to create. And so I think, he represents what we're really like. Because we all have that stuff going on. We all feel like we're a misfit in one way or another, and that's precisely what we have to contend with. So yeah, for me, he was definitely, I could certainly identify with him, and I think I suspect that was Huxley's intention. Um,
Yeah.
Although I kind of like the Mustafa Mond, the world director as well,
Yes. Yes.
uh, because he was at least honest with himself. Yeah, I
Yes.
chose this. The truth is I just prefer this. And he knew what he was doing, so he made a conscious choice to do what he did. And when I listen to some of his arguments, it's interesting. I don't agree with his assessment of the Bible and Shakespeare and literature, but there are good reasons to recognize that not everybody can handle that, and we have to contend with people who don't know how to handle that, and that's very difficult. Their solution, obviously, it's a fiction, so it would never hold up in the real world, but at least I don't think it would, not for very long anyway. um, but it poses some important questions, though the solutions themselves, like unfortunately like the Communist Manifesto, sound good on paper but fall apart in actual practice.
And here is Wikipedia's description of the Mustafa Mond character. He's the resident world controller of Western Europe. He is sophisticated and good natured. He is an urbane and intelligent advocate of the world state and its ethos of community, identity, stability. Among the novel's characters, he is uniquely aware of the precise nature of the society he oversees and what it has given up to accomplish its gains. He argues that art, literature, and scientific freedom must be sacrificed to secure the ultimate utilitarian goal of maximizing social happiness. He defends the caste system, behavioral conditioning, and the lack of personal freedom in the world state. These, he says, are a price worth paying for achieving social stability, the highest social virtue because it leads to lasting happiness. Okay, I think I'm about ready to wrap up this live stream. Any final thoughts, Richard?
Well, I think Mustafa Mond's the argument that he makes um, has to be juxtaposed against the in all of the individual considerations. Yes, you do have to make sacrifices for your society, but it's not an all or nothing game. It's very much more complex than that. So he's taking one side of that, but that has to be incorporated along with all the other perspectives that the book presents. I think that's how I come away from the book.
Okay, great. Thank you, Richard. I placed a link to Richard's YouTube channel. And what's the status update on your book?
It's in editing mode. I have people helping me with editing it and doing some rewrites. And my hope is certainly by the end of the year, if not sooner, to have it really out. Um, and so I'm very excited about that. I have some friends who we're all kind of got together. We all have our books more or less in the same at the same state. We're about ready to publish it, but we still have a few things to do before we do that. And so we're supporting each other in that, which is really exciting and really a lot of fun.
And you're also working on an album. So what's going on with that?
I actually am putting the finishing touches on that next week. I have my nephew coming. He's a cellist, and we're gonna track in some cello parts for that, and then we're gonna do the final mixes and master it. What I shared with you, that was the very rough mix. That's not what the final mix is going to sound like, but it gives you an idea where it's headed. That's going to be a 4-song EP, and I think the title of the EP is going to be the same as the title song I gave you, "Blaze of Heaven." And it's really it's about my spiritual journey, starting from 35 years ago when I was a pagan, which the first song in the EP is a reflection of, to Blaze of Heaven, which is kind of where I am now, and different couple of points along the way of that development, that spiritual development.
Yeah, that's a great title, Blaze of Heaven. All right, thanks, Richard. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.
Thanks, Luke. Great, as always, wonderful talking to you.